welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're excited to be here today. My name is Leanne Scotto Adams. I'm the Executive Director of SNAAP. Welcome to, I think, our fifth SNAAPChat. This is sort of a new endeavor of SNAAP's, and we try to offer a monthly online discussion with scholars, folks, partners who use the SNAAP data in their work. And we'd like to bring them to you to engage you in discussion. So really anyone who's interested in arts education and the impact of creative careers, these are conversations for you. I am going to hand this over to my colleague, Christian Folk. It's so great to see so many of you here, and we'll get started.
Hi everyone. Like Leanne said, thank you so much for coming today. We're really excited about the topic that we have for you today. So our presenters for this Snapchat are Gwen Rugg, who's a senior research scientist at the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, and Jessica Feldman, who is a senior research associate at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. They recently completed a national survey of artists, which was commissioned by Mellon, conducted by NORC, and they're going to share some of the findings and just kind of some implications on their work. So I will turn it over to them.
Great. So thank you to Leanne and to Kristen and SNAAP for the opportunity to be here with you today. Just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about what this work grew out of. So the study need, as we saw it at the time. So this work really grew out of the responsive grant making and program design that was being undertaken by my colleagues at Mellon at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in their planning, they sought data on the arts workforce to effectively design for artists' needs. And they hit upon a few limitations in the existing data. So to be clear, these are not inherent problems with the data, but they were encountering data sets that were simply designed for other purposes. So they were finding that there were data sets that were not nationally representative. So based on specific geographies, on disciplines, on member-based lists, on program participants. A great example, a wonderful data set from CRNY, the Portrait of New York State Artists, which is a portrait of the people that applied to that program and were scoped into application on the basis of need. So the estimate of artist characteristics is specific to that sample. There are also representative data sets and really kind of fantastic and well-established estimates of labor force participation. Those identify artists based on the most hours spent in remunerative work in a reference week. And so we have the American Community Survey, we have the Current Population Survey, who are really not seeing artists who organize their professional creative practices in other ways. While on the other hand, we also have representative data sets that are really quite broad. So the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts gives us an estimate of engagement in the arts. And so this is really, it sees broadly how Americans are both consuming and producing art, but it doesn't allow us to discern the professionals from the hobbyists. And so if we turn to the next slide, we'll see that this project is really the result of the work of many of my current and former colleagues at the Mellon Foundation coming together to engage Gwen and her team at NORC. And Gwen's team brought to bear NORC's unique survey design expertise and their AmeriSpeak panel to really develop a creative solution, which is a nationally representative survey that's inclusive of an artist population that had previously been unseen in other national survey data. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gwen, who will share how NORC developed this work.
Thanks, Jessica, and hi, everyone. Nice to be here with you today. So just to touch on sort of how this study is unique or what the unique features of it are, it really tells us things about artists in the US that no other study currently does. And just to highlight a couple key features of this study. First, as Jessica just mentioned, this is a nationally representative study. So we utilized a methodology to locate artists across the country such that the artist sample we generated is reflective of the US population as a whole. And I'll share more details about our methods in a minute. The second sort of unique feature of this study is that we had a distinctive, compared to other studies, means of identifying artists within the population. I mean, of course, there is no singular, like, correct conceptualization of who an artist is. But for this study, we really sought to locate a population of professional artists, but where professionalism isn't necessarily tied to your job title or how much money you make through your art. So this ended up giving us an artist pool that is essentially more inclusive than those studies that just count artists according to occupational categories, as Jessica mentioned earlier. So our sample ends up including folks like culture bearers or those whose main or secondary jobs aren't within certain artist occupations, but who still have serious, sustained artistic practices with professional intent. And then at the same time, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, our artist sample is more restrictive than the sort of broadest conceptualization of an artist. Jessica mentioned the SPPA, the Survey of Public Participation in the Arts, which basically includes anyone who does anything creative. So we applied criteria that would weed out people who have a practice, but that's maybe just for personal reasons and don't really make an effort to professionalize or share their work publicly. And I'll share more details about how exactly we went about finding these artists and screening them to take the survey in a minute. One final feature I just wanted to touch on is that the study captures details on artists' employment that go beyond what current data can tell us. We have pretty comprehensive details on artists' work lives over the past year, and those details include details on jobs beyond just like a primary job or a secondary job. And this includes, various work arrangements, including non-traditional work, part-time work, temporary work, things like that. And we'll share some fun findings about artists' work lives and lives in general toward the end of this presentation. But as promised, I will just dive into methods with a little more detail right now. A couple features that I want to highlight here is that we essentially used a multi-source sampling plan to garner our sample of artists. And this is where SNAAP comes in. So we combined 3 different samples, one of which was a probability-based sample and 2 of which were non-probability samples. The probability-based sample we utilized is called AmeriSpeak. Some of you might be familiar with it already. It's essentially NORC's in-house kind of gold standard probability-based panel that is representative of the entire population of US households. And we could have probably gotten away with just using AmeriSpeak, but the AmeriSpeak panel is only so large, and at the start of this study, we had no sense of how many artists might exist within the AmeriSpeak panel. We didn't know what the incidence rate would be or the population size would be. So we designed the study to supplement the AmeriSpeak sample with 2 non-probability samples. And one of them was a vendor that NORC works with sometimes called Lucid, and the second one was SNAAP. And working with SNAAP was a real no-brainer here. We hypothesized that there would be, a much higher incidence rate of eligible artists within this group of folks who had art and design degrees. They're essentially sitting ducks for us, which was so great. So we reached out to SNAAP early on in the survey design process and It ended up being really beautiful timing because at the time, SNAAP was looking to sort of develop and test out a panel model themselves. They had never surveyed their pool for anything beyond just like the core SNAAP survey. So together, we essentially ended up piloting what eventually became SNAAP Pulse through this study. So it was just a really wonderful and mutually beneficial collaboration there. So utilizing these these three sample sources, we then used NORC has this methodology called True North, which essentially calibrates data from non-probability surveys with probability-based Amerispeak data to make the entire data set nationally representative. So we kind of spliced together these three samples, applied this methodology called True North, and that gave us our nationally representative sample of artists. One other thing I'll mention in terms of methodology is that it really was a field-informed survey design. Both the screener through which we identified artists and the survey questions themselves were informed by a very extensive literature review and scan of existing survey instruments. And this spanned multiple domains. We looked at literature and surveys of artists, but we also looked at labor surveys, gig work in particular surveys, health and well-being surveys. And we tried to use validated survey measures where possible, just because that's kind of a best practice. But we also ended up creating some custom questions for this survey. And the whole survey instrument also came together through the extensive input from an advisory board that we put together, and the advisory board included artists, arts workers, arts researchers, to make sure that the questions we were asking were relevant and clear. I was going to talk about the field process too, but honestly, that was pretty straightforward, and it's all detailed in our technical report. So if anyone is interested, you can read the full spiel there. Or if anyone has specific questions, we can discuss at the end. But basically, it was a multi-stage field process. We did a pilot round, and then we did a main survey fielding. When we were trying to think about what the group of folks on this call today might be interested in, we thought that people might be interested to learn more details about how exactly we identified artists. So I want to walk you through those elements. So we tried to be really expansive and think about essentially, what are some different indicators that someone is creating artistic works in a serious and sustained way. So we did, we scanned a lot of other surveys and research studies, and we kind of observed the different ways that they had conceptualized artists, and we entertained many different potential screener criteria, but eventually we ended up with a set of 5 screener items. So the first was what we called our practice criterion, and this is just, does someone do creative activities? And if so, what creative activities do they do? And the goal here was really to include a pretty expansive range of creative practices. We ended up with 31 eligible creative practices. And just for reference, I think standard NEA reporting on artists usually includes, I think it's 11 creative practices. So we tried to be pretty expansive here. The second criterion we looked at, we called our engagement criterion, and this is how someone engages with their creative practice. And the goal here was really to suss out people who engage in a more professional manner versus more just sort of hobbyists or amateurs. The third criterion was what we called our audience criterion, and this is who, if anyone, do people share their artistic works with? And the objective here was to screen people in who make some attempt to share their work publicly. So that is with people beyond just their most immediate friends and family. The fourth criterion we called our recognition criterion, and that is essentially, would someone else call them an artist? And here we're just trying to get at sort of how they're perceived in the world. We did think about having this be a sort of self-recognition criterion. Do they self-define as an artist? And we actually did ask that question later in the survey, but we opted not to have that be a screener item, just because, whether one thinks of oneself as an artist can be kind of fraught, and it can be influenced by things ranging from like one's cultural background to their level of formal training to their level of perceived success. It can get kind of thorny. So we wanted to sort of externalize that and take it outside the person's own conception. Finally, the fifth criterion that we looked at was hours spent engaging with their creative practice. And the goal here was to screen people in who essentially have a consistent artistic practice. In our pilot round, we did some sensitivity testing. We played around with different thresholds for how many minimum hours would be required to screen in. And we ended up setting the very most modest criterion of just, do they engage with their practice for at least an hour every week? So, using these criteria, how many artists did we find? Our screening process was essentially a funnel where people got cut out or continued on at a few different junctures. So that's why this diagram looks like this. And using our criteria, we essentially got to an 18% incidence rate, and we ended up having about 2,600 eligible respondents in our sample. I do want to highlight just a few, I don't know if I should use the word caveats, but certainly just limitations or things that we want to call your attention to with this study. First is just, of course, as I said before, there is no sort of right or best definition of an artist. We wanted to cast a relatively broad net and include folks who are working professionally but might have been missed by other studies because they didn't meet certain criteria. So that was kind of our orientation here. But I do want to highlight that we recognize that anybody else might define an artist differently. And so one of the things we wanted to offer through this study was a public use data file that essentially allows people to play around with artist criteria and create their own if they don't agree with ours. They can't broaden or like relax the criteria for who should be counted as an artist. But for example, if someone wanted to look at just a certain subset of artists within our sample, they could tighten the criteria. For example, they could only look at people who have their primary job as being within the arts. Or if you think the 1 hour a week threshold is too low, you can look at people who worked at least 5 hours a week on their creative practices, things like that. So we wanted to just allow people some flexibility there. And the other thing is, there are a couple of groups that we could think of that might not be represented in these data. So we just wanted to call attention to those. One is artists who have not engaged in their practices in the past year, because the past year was our reference period for this study. The second is people who exclusively identify as designers. And that was a choice that we made. We can get into our rationale for this if anyone's interested. We also detail some of that in our report. And the third is potentially certain linguistic subgroups. The survey was fielded in English and Spanish, so people who aren't English or Spanish speaking would not be included here. Now With all those caveats, I will turn it over to Jessica to just discuss a couple new things that we have learned about artists in the US.
Great, thanks, Gwen. So by screening in artists in the way that Gwen described, and then by asking a detailed set of questions about multiple job holding, we gain a new perspective on characteristics of the US adult artist population. And just wanted to highlight a few things that stood out for us in reviewing the data. So one, as Gwen mentioned, we have a new estimate of the prevalence of US adult artists. So in between that very strict labor force definition, so about 1.6% of US adults being estimated as artists using the current population survey labor force definition, more than half of adults participating in the arts. We get a new view of this group of dedicated arts professionals and culture bearers. We also learn about, with a different slice, obviously we're going to see different population characteristics. Just to the prevalence point, and why this might matter. As Gwen said, when we were designing this, we truly had no idea what incidence rate to anticipate. So I think this also gives us, like, if we were to do this again, we would have a different we might have a different sampling plan. I think this just anchors us in this new view of the population where truly we had kind of no idea where this was going to land. Different population characteristics. So obviously this is not a direct comparison. We have new data and we have a new population. And I'm speaking here from my perspective sitting within a foundation where we're really consumers of the existing kind of summaries of data out there. So we turn to things like the NEA Statistical Portrait of Artists to understand who are these populations that we're designing for and serving. And so with this different slice, with this different definition, we're seeing different characteristics. So we're seeing a greater prevalence of disabled artists. We're seeing less health insurance coverage. This may lead to a different understanding, different decision making from the perspective of those of us who are really kind of data consumers. Again, not making a direct comparison, the NEA data was published in 2019 based on the ACS and CPS data from 2012 to 2017. But just to say, we now have a kind of refreshed and new population to look at. We also have estimates that we just simply did not have before. So in nationally representative sample surveys. So we're seeing that 11% of artists report holding 3+ jobs in the 12 months prior to the survey. 5% held 4+ jobs. Again, we thought at one point, kind of Mellon wanted NORC to do a kind of like a snapshot of the like 4 and 5+ job holding artists. We thought that there would be just like this big portrait that we could pull out. And there were actually so few respondents that held that job profile that it was there weren't enough kind of respondents to create that profile. And so this to us was also a learning that we have now these estimates. Finally, I think it was interesting to us also to see that, for example, you know, we didn't screen an artist on the basis of job holding, and yet we still see that for those artists who held a job in the 12 months prior to the survey, the majority of them held the job in which they earn the most money, their main job, in an arts occupation. And so we weren't revealing like a kind of huge population of primarily gig working artists that hadn't been seen before. And so we just point these out as a few new perspectives on artists that stood out to us, but our real hope and focus in making the survey instrument, the screener, and the data set available, and I believe that Christian has been putting the links into the chat, and we will also, our last slide has a link to these resources that are available on NADAC. Our real hope is that people continue to use and refine this data and to ask their own questions. And with that, I think we would welcome turning this over to questions and discussions.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Gwen. Yeah, please raise your hand, put your questions in the chat. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, so definitely some time to answer questions. Just doing a scan for hands. If you want to take yourself off mute and start talking, go for it. And Gwen, maybe take down this slide and we can put that information in the chat just so we can interface with the audience?
Sure, happy to.
Yeah. I feel like you've stunned the audience.
Hey, Kyle
Kyle?
Hernandez, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, MIAD, Art and Design College, in ACAD. This is really interesting. Of the sampling, of course, 84% have health insurance versus 88%. Of the national, do we have national numbers of artists to flesh out the difference there in the hundreds of thousands versus, is there federal data where that 4%, do we have an impact of that nationwide or an estimate of those who are uninsured with just that 4% difference in health insurance?
Yeah, I think that's something to look into more. I mean, it's not a direct one-to-one comparison, again, for the reasons that Jessica shared. And the most recent data are from 2019. So that 88% was in 2019. And this 84% in 2024. It is interesting to note that, there have been a lot of changes in the healthcare system in that time, and it would be super fun to look into that more.
Great. I think we have a hand in the audience. Kate?
Hi, calling in from South Portland, Maine. I'm actually working on a study on the economic impact of arts, creative work in Maine, certainly looking at the gig-based work and how it's connected directly to workforce development, and using the education system as a way to get at workforce development more clearly and more significantly. So as we put together our survey, are there any gaps that I could be on the lookout for in regards to that specific area of connecting arts and typically new arts graduates within work development needs?
Great question. If I can ask a little more, what are the specific aims of that survey?
Well, we're kind of looking backwards. So we want to, I work within the Maine community college system. So we have a really, really tried and true connection with workforce development sponsored by the state. And I'm trying to look at the existing workforce, what they're missing, and what they could actually find within an arts graduate or within a working artist that they already have, that they just haven't created those connections between the language or the canon of understanding what an arts education provides for students. So really, I haven't found any data or surveys or question samples that try and get at that connection. So I guess I'm bugging you for insight on if that's been tapped into, or if there's something that could help form the work we're doing here.
Yeah, happy to talk more about that, for sure. Have you gotten to look at our one of the things that's available through this study is our full questionnaire. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at that
I'm working
yet, I think.
working through it all. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think that would be a good place to start. And if you ever want to talk offline, we have a whole database of the survey instruments that we reviewed, and I would be happy to talk with you about whether there are any instruments that we reviewed that didn't make it onto our survey for space, but might have relevant questions for you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. I see, Diane, I see your hand up, but I just want to get to a question that came in a little while ago in the chat. Gwen and Jessica, do you see any major differences in the employment data when you disaggregate by industry?
Interesting. That's not something that we had, but so you're speaking with comparisons with with other data sources?
Hi, I'm Meredith. I'm the one who asked the question. I was thinking, like, if you look at creatives who are working in advertising versus tech or versus healthcare, something like that, if you notice any difference in employment rates. I don't know if you looked at satisfaction, just things like that.
I wish we had gotten to look at satisfaction. That's not something that we had gotten to look into. That's Jessica, I don't know if you have any comments there. That's something that we would love. I was, if we had time, I was hoping to solicit kind of one of our next steps is diving into the data further and kind of crowdsourcing top of mind questions from folks in the field to look into more extensively. So I'm making a note of that here.
Great. And Diane, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Sure. First off, just thank you so much for doing this. It's so useful. I actually have a whole printout on my desk and I have been through it really thoroughly. Great to have a chance to chat with you as well. I do want to know, because I see a lot of questions in the chat about the health insurance. We've been surveying artist participants in our programs for almost 17 years, and that would mirror our data based on timeline. So it used to be 25% of artists didn't have insurance, and then the ACA went fully into effect, and then almost everybody had it. And then I've seen a regular and precipitous decline year after year over the past several years. And certainly we don't have a gigantic pool that we're looking at, but it's very consistent across different communities as well. My question is related to that number, 18.2%, because that is certainly what stands out to me, especially when we've been using 1.6% all this time, right? And we knew that that was a huge underrepresentation, but there's such a jump between those two numbers, and that has, really significant implications in terms of, especially when we're all asking for funding and things like that, almost 1 in 5 Americans, working adult Americans, is an artist by that definition. And so I guess, and it doesn't feel unfair to me, your criteria, but I do wonder, if you were to redesign this, would you adjust any of those eligibility measures? Like, the one that stands out to me in particular is the 1 hour per week, possibly. I don't know. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, because as I share that number out with people, that is a huge question that I get.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And I mean, it was a little bit of a surprise to us too. As Jessica said, going into this, I mean, it was essentially one of the research questions was what is the incidence rate of artists in the population? And the thing that I'll say, I kind of said this earlier, but we sort of erred on the side of breadth with the knowledge that one can then further restrict the criteria. So we had the opportunity to capture the data from people. And then, if someone feels like the 1 hour is kind of iffy or anything, they can restrict it themselves. So it basically gives people more options for conceptualizing artists in the way that feels right for them or for their given research questions. So I don't know that I would change it. I think if we did, we might have risked excluding some folks that we really wanted to capture here. I don't know, Jessica, if you have different feelings, but my personal feeling was like this was an experiment. This was, we came up with the criteria that we did, and I did prefer to err on the side of breadth.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. I don't know if Jessica, you were going to chime in there, but there is a sort of related question in the chat. Did the decision to exclude designers mainly exclude traditional design categories such as graphic design, or did it more widely exclude arts practitioners who do work such as video game design, animation, web design, or whose duties and careers such as PR or corporate communication might include design activity?
Yes. So it excluded people who said that their sole creative practice that they did in this sort of professional way that would have met the other criteria was any number of design categories. We had a pretty extensive list, and I do think it included things like video game design in addition to more traditional graphic design, etc. I do want to make clear that if someone did say that they did design, but they also did some other eligible creative activity, they were still included. So there are inevitably a lot of designers that made their way into the artist sample. It's only people who exclusively said they were designers who did not make it in.
Mm. Thanks, Gwen.
Yeah.
And just time for one last question, and I want to riff a little bit off of this after I ask it to you, Gwen and Jessica. But did any of the questions in the National Survey for Artists deal with how or if their work is being affected by AI?
No, I so wish we could have asked that.
Yeah.
I think the original survey instrument that we developed or would have liked to have fielded was like 4 times as long as the actual amount of time that we had for this survey. That would be fascinating, and I think if we had the opportunity to field the survey again, my dream would be to have sort of a core set of questions that we repeated, but maybe swap them out for sort of
Right.
immediately relevant topics.
Yeah, and I think, Gwen, you might know this, and members of our audience might know this. We actually fielded a significant survey to the arts alumni in our SNAAP Pulse panel. The survey was fielded last month. We have all of the data, and we're going to be releasing it next month. We'll be doing a SNAAPChat next month on this very topic. We're calling February the month of AI. So we hope you all come back and join us for a SNAAPChat. And learn about the data that we collected. We surveyed arts alumni on how their work is being affected, but also their perceptions of AI in general, why they choose to use it or may not want to use it, some of the ethical concerns involved there. And then it's a longitudinal study. So we plan to ask the same alumni every year, the same set of questions to really see how those perceptions and uses change. We ask extensive questions around their current use of AI, the different programs they use. So we're really excited about this data. We have a kind of a suite of AI offerings that we'll be putting out next month.
Yeah, we're also planning on adding some AI questions to the 2027 survey that we asked for institutions. We're trying to squeeze some in there. There's a lot of interest in this, so we really think it's important for the institutions to know and also for the field to know how AI is being used.
Great. Thanks, Angie, for chiming in. Well, yeah, thanks. We remarkably somehow stayed pretty close to being on time, even with all the questions. Gwen and Jessica. Gwen, I think I put your email in the chat. Jessica, let me just stick yours in there too, if that's okay. And I would say, email me. I can pass along your questions to Gwen and Jessica, or feel free to reach out to them directly. And we'll be putting the recording of this online if you need to access it later. And just thanks so much. Thanks to Gwen, thanks to Jessica, and thanks to everyone who came and the SNAAP staff. Take care, everyone.